Hi, I'm Mike Day and welcome to the Third Party Therapy Podcast. Modern slavery is a topic I've been looking at for a while. It doesn't really get the focus it deserves within TPRM, but as something with a real human cost, it deserves more attention. Shayne Tyler is a supply chain modern slavery expert with over 20 years first-hand experience of worker exploitation and successful resolution. I was lucky enough to meet Shayne a couple of years ago and was struck by his experience. This is a guy who has seen this human cost firsthand, and his insight is invaluable. I'm thrilled to welcome him to the Third Party Therapy Podcast. So, Shayne, thank you for taking time out to join us on the Third Party Therapy Podcast today.
You're welcome, Mike. Nice to speak with you.
You and I did a presentation at CEFPRO a few years back. I've been keen to get you on this podcast since we've started it. The whole topic of modern slavery, hugely important. But before we discuss that further, I just want to explore how you got into this area. I know you had some very direct experience to these issues that we'll be talking about. So can you just start by giving us some background on how you got involved in this area, please?
Yeah, well, following or while doing my degree at university in the 1990s, I was already working at that point in the food industry to earn some extra money. So when I came out of completing my degree, I was working in the food industry, and I've worked in operational roles since the 80s and early 90s, taking on management roles in the mid 90s. In one of those early roles, when I was the operations manager facility in March in Cambridgeshire, on the 19th of June 2000, my factory was on panorama for the illegal employment of over 200 staff. Now, the TV programme aired that night, and I have to stress everything that was said in that TV programme was true. There were illegals that had infiltrated our facility. And it spoke about how, and criticised us for how we had not followed recruitment procedures. Now, we believed we had. We still believe to this day that we hadn't done anything wrong. Arguably, we might not have done enough, but this gang had found the gaps and got in. I think what really opened my eyes to it was after the TV programme and that everything was dying down, there was not really much noise about it, and I needed to understand what happened and how to prevent it. And then I started engaging with the victims, those workers themselves, and then my eyes were opened. I had workers on as little as 17 pence per hour. I had sexual exploitation that was taking place with these victims. They were just after a better life, and that was their vulnerability, and it was exploited. It was just perpetrated in my facility. It was the first time I ever heard the phrase, the situations were akin to modern slavery, and I couldn't believe what it could happen in the UK, never mind my factory. And from that day, I vowed it wouldn't happen again. Sadly, I found cases every single year since.
I think, having this direct exposure to this direct experience, not only to the human cost of modern slavery, which we'll go into in a lot more detail as we go through, but also, I guess, if I can just touch on the sort of the reputational damage that did to the company who you were working for at the time, to be splashed across panorama, that must have been quite a significant sort of impact to that from a corporate level.
Yeah, it had two levels. It was a bit weird because the day it actually happened was the day after many people will remember in the United Kingdom. On the 18th of June 2000, 58 Chinese nationals suffocated in the back of a lorry coming through the port of Dover, and everybody remembers that. So for this to happen the day after that certainly received a high level of exposure. And halfway through the programme, the reporter said to the buyer from the retailer that was taking our produce, now that you know that your main supplier of this produce is employing illegal workers, I'm sure you'll be cancelling their contract. So there was a lot of commercial threat that sat around that at the time. And the retailer was brilliant, because the retailer said, well, no, why would we do that? We'll follow Ethics 101. We will engage with them, find out what went wrong, improve, and see what we can do to prevent. So there was an immediate downscaling, if you like, of the immediate threat to us. But that didn't take the pressure off from the senior people within the business who saw that we had scored a massive own goal, or that was what it was felt, and there was a lot of pressure that was placed on the business. Certainly cost us a lot of money to try and put things right. On a personal level, um, it it's affected me for the rest of my life. Um, I when I started engaging with the workers to find out what had happened, which many of them had been left destitute. Um, yeah, I experienced stories and examples from these people that have stayed with me ever since, and I felt tremendously guilty. I couldn't have done anything really to have prevented it, because it turned out the documents we were accused of not checking were legitimate documents. They'd just been fraudulently completed, so even if we had done the checks, we would never have spotted it. But we had done the checks anyway. It was that was the frustration. So there was this criticism from outside, an awareness of we knew what really had gone on but couldn't talk about it, massive amount of cost that was going into a business to try and put some form of remedy in terms of the processes and systems. And for me, the people that had actually perpetrated the crime, the exploiters, nothing was being said or done to them. They had just ran for the hills and gone. Um, yeah, and it changed the rest of my life. I couldn't walk away from it anymore. I knew it was there, and I had to walk towards it, and I had to go find it, and I had to try and make sure that that didn't happen again, because modern slavery breaks people down to a level where even some of the most primal aspects that you would normally notice in a certain person's eyes has been stripped away. It's like they're dead behind their eyes. They've been stripped back to such a core level. It's horrible.
Absolutely horrible. I want to explore that a lot more as we go through and talk about how we can look at things that are more effective rather than just, dare I say it, box ticking exercises. And I think, talking about your your experience in this case, where did you actually have effective processes that would look to prevent modern slavery, or did you have processes that tick the box to say, oh, we look at modern slavery and off we go? And I think that's a very real topic even today that we need to get into. But before we get to that, can we just bring it up to the here and now, just talk about what modern slavery actually is? You hear the term thrown around quite a bit. Could you just explain to us what is modern slavery, what isn't modern slavery, and what has to be present for it to be seen as modern slavery?
Yeah, first thing to realise that with modern slavery is it's a massive subject area. It goes from organ harvesting, prostitution, um, being forced to commit criminal acts, being forced to do work with no pay. There are a raft of actual main titles. The vast majority of modern slavery that I see, and the vast majority of modern slavery that I see in the corporate world, is that of forced labour. And most of that forced labour is perpetrated through human trafficking. Now, human trafficking doesn't have to cross a border. People think of human trafficking as um, people coming from foreign lands, when in fact, actually, the most common victim of human trafficking or exploitation or modern slavery in the United Kingdom is British. Now, these same rules apply to all of the other conditions of modern slavery, whether it be forced to commit a crime, prostitution, etc. It's made up of three parts. Those three parts are action, means, and purpose. Now, the action is the transportation, harbouring, or receipt of a person. The means is where you have control and power over them for the purpose of making money. You have to be all three to be a victim of human trafficking for the purposes of forced labour. If you were, for example, transported, received, for money, but there was no control and power over you, that's smuggling. If, for example, there was control and power over you to extract money, but you weren't harboured, received, or transported, well, that's extortion. It has to be all three, and it's very difficult to prove. How do you prove somebody had control of you when there's no chains? And that's very often the case with modern day slavery. There's no physical chains. There doesn't seem to be any physical links to some of those people at all. Many of the control mechanisms are through debt or loans through third parties, where your family may have stumped up the money for you to go do something, and actually it's them who have got to pay it back. So quite often you see people being controlled by their emotions. Those emotions, again, are often thought to be things like fear. But the reality is many people are controlled through pride or hope. It's a mental chain. How do you prove that? So therefore it makes modern day slavery a very, very difficult crime to prosecute. Likewise with transport, harbour and receive. Many victims, if they're in the UK or are freely allowed to travel to the UK, haven't been trafficked at all. Therefore, you don't have to cross a border. If you are moving one person from one field to another field or one office to another office for the purpose of exploitation, then you have trafficked them. That's why it doesn't have to cross a border. And then the final part of purpose for the money. Well, that's actually present in every single one of the crimes, whether it be you're being exploited for prostitution or whether you're being exploited for drugs. The point is always that it's to do with money. So it's a very, very difficult crime. And actually, on a personal level, I don't like the term modern day slavery. Modern day slavery creates connotations from the past about what slavery is. And most victims that I've met don't see themselves as slaves. They see themselves as being exploited. And likewise, when you think of it from that perspective and you start looking at how they're being exploited and what control and power over them, you can still use the AMP process, but you start seeing exploitation in its more fledgling levels long before it ever becomes modern day slavery. And therefore, if you can prevent it, disrupt it at that level, you're actually doing far better work.
I just pick up on something you said on there, and about a lot of, if we take the UK as an example, there is this perception that modern slavery is, and you touched on the that tragic case of the Chinese migrants that perished in the back of the lorry. It is about trafficking multiple people across borders. There's usually a link made with sort of illegal migrants, and then bringing them into this country and putting them to work in sort of manual roles. What is what is the state of modern slavery in the UK? I mean, is that the majority of where modern slavery sits, or is it, as you said, actually, British people who are already resident, who've maybe been born here already, being the victims of modern day slavery?
It's both, but for slightly different reasons, but for one central core reason that's the same. Every single victim has one thing in common: vulnerability. They're all vulnerable to something. Now, how to best define that vulnerability is to assume that vulnerability in the circumstances of modern day slavery or exploitation is reliance on somebody else. So you're vulnerable and then you become reliant on somebody else. And then what you hope for is the reliance on somebody else is that that person does not exploit that circumstance, that reliance. So if you take, for example, trafficking rings of British girls that have popped up in some of the towns around the United Kingdom, they're vulnerable by their very nature. They're under 18 and there are issues that sit around that. And then there are other vulnerabilities that sit there. But ultimately, they then become reliant. There is some level of grooming in that case. Similar happens in the corporate world if somebody's being forced to work. If I need to get a visa and somebody can speak the language and help me get that visa, then I am vulnerable to them. And it's then only by luck and judgment of whether that person exploits that circumstance or not. Some of those are exacerbated even more depending on the poverty of the home country that some of these workers are coming from. They're travelling here legally, they're coming in to help the UK economy, but very often they're caught out in exploitation back in their home country through fee payments, through paying for services, other things that may take place. British victims are there because we win purely on numbers for vulnerability. We have far many more British people in the United Kingdom than we do foreign people, and therefore, by its very nature, we have more vulnerable. Drug addicts, homeless. In fact, there was a very famous case in Lincolnshire, one of the early cases of modern slavery that was prosecuted, where the victims were homeless men who were being picked up by a travelling gang who was going around and making these men work for very small amounts of money by putting driveways in people's property. So it is about that vulnerability. You just happen to have more vulnerabilities with foreign nationals because there are some of the fundamentals that are there, poverty, language barriers, etc., that exacerbate it.
And where do we see this in, bringing this back to the corporate world? Where do we see this? I think a lot of corporate people, a lot of people in sort of roles such as third party risk or supply chain or the wider corporate world will sort of see modern slavery as a distant risk, as a risk that may involve you could definitely see it in agriculture or food or areas that have high degree of manual activity involved in it. But if you look at the sort of the more corporate world, the finance, pharmaceuticals, all of these sort of areas, how relevant is it to those industries? Where do we still see it rearing its ugly head?
Well, it's everywhere. First off, let me share a statistic with you. Back in 2017, a survey was completed by the PEW Research Centre, which published their report in 2019, which looked at 4 countries in the European Union at the time, and the number of people in those countries that did not have the right to live and work there. In the UK, the figure was estimated between 800,000 and 1.2 million people. Now, since then, we've obviously had a tremendous amount of turmoil through things like Brexit, the introduction of the UK immigration policy, and some of the variations that has caused. Last year, there was in excess of 740,000 people entered the UK. Now, I'm not suggesting for one second that they're illegal, far from it. Point being that there is leakage out of this variability, and the chances are that that number has probably increased since the research was estimated in 2017. 1.2 million people is equivalent to 2% of the UK population, 1 in 50 people. So any activities in the corporate world where you are interacting with more than 50 people, the chances are you are going to be engaging with somebody who does not have the right to live and work here. Now that causes a significant amount of potential challenge, because if somebody cannot have the right to live and work here and does not have the right to public funds such as NHS, etc., how do they survive? Now, if you was to think of a corporate company that could be doing all of its checks to make sure that, and let's make up Tyler, my second name, Tyler's Delivery Company, and I deliver fast food around London to all different businesses. And I go and do everything I can to go and check all of the people that come and I employ. The chances are I don't check who's on the bike. So worker substitution is extremely common. I see it every week of the year. There are gaps in most corporate businesses' processes where these people are getting in and they are living and surviving. You then have scenarios that are taking place in the corporate world where some of their processes, their acts or their omissions are adding to it further. So I had one case back in 2018 where a man every Friday night could be seen at a cash point in Birmingham, and for 25 minutes he would be emptying the accounts of the victims that he had based at 3 addresses around Birmingham. 25 minutes every Friday. Um, Surely that is something that might not directly affect the bank, but through its processes or procedures could identify that anomaly so that certain circumstances could be prevented somewhere else in the supply chain. It's about how we all really come together and collaborate and deal with some of the things that we pick up, really.
So I mean, that's a very interesting example there, because I work in the finance industry already. There's obviously a lot of focus on anti-money laundering, fraud, mechanisms put in place to detect unusual behaviour from customers. It sounds like there's potentially opportunities there for things like the telltale signs from modern slavery to also be built into that, and for companies to try and look at that in a bit more detail.
Most definitely. In fact, it's why I came away from the corporate world and set up my own business to go help businesses, because what I was becoming more and more frustrated with was people were completing a box ticking exercise. An exercise of, oh, we need to go do this check because this is a sign of modern slavery and this is what we need to go do. Or we need to write this modern slavery statement, or we need to write this policy. I have to say, in 24 years of dealing with this, I've not met an exploiter yet that has cared one iota about a company's policy. They do, though, care very much about what your processes are, because that is what they have to infiltrate. If we go back to action, means and purpose again for a short moment. Action, means and purpose, the transportation, harbouring a receipt of a product where you have control and power over that product for the purpose of making money from that product. That's a business. When I was in the produce industry, I was doing that, for example, say with potatoes every day. I harboured it, I had control and power over it, and I sold it for profit. So therefore, if you think of it from a business perspective, if you wanted to improve your performance, you improve your processes. You don't improve your policies. And that's all they are doing. That's how they are competing against us. So now what I do very much is I engage with corporate businesses to go through their supply chains and go through their business structures to understand what their process is and then how I can get in. I think probably the most extraordinary one I had was I went to go visit a labour provider a couple of years ago, and walked into the meeting room with stacks and stacks of papers, knowing what I was going to audit against. And I asked the person that came in, could they take the documents back and to now give me half an hour? And in that half an hour, I created a new Shayne. And then I put all those documents through their system, and at the end of the process gave them nearly 30 critical non-compliances because their processes did not spot that I was providing them with false information. In the finance world, because of other controls that you have in, many of those processes actually work. So you're doing it, for example, if I wanted to go through and get a mortgage, I'll get massive checks done on me to go and do that, or making sure that I'm not doing any money laundering, etc. So those processes are there, but that standard of process, those checks and balances might not be there for where you get your desk furniture from. Therefore, you're perpetrating it through your emission by using the wrong processes in your supply chain.
So I want to come back to that towards the end in terms of how people can put in effective processes
Yeah.
to really make a difference here. Um, Before we get to that, though, I just want to go back and touch on something. So you were talking earlier about the changes that have been uh, occurring globally over the last few years. You mentioned Brexit. Obviously, we've got conflict in sort of Ukraine, in Gaza. We've got we've had political changes as well through that period. We've had COVID. How have you seen the whole area of modern slavery change over that period? Has it changed shape? Has it increased, decreased? We're really interested in how you've seen the whole um, the evolution of it over the last few years.
Yeah, there's been massive change, and situation are getting worse purely as more vulnerables are taking place. Um, the first thing I would probably stress that's the big change is investment in resources. So resolutions from government or resources from government um, just simply are not sufficient. Um, Even if you take into account the setting up of things like the GLAA in the food sector, or some of the other initiatives that they've wanted to do, they're a drop in the ocean. And then there's being asked for businesses to go and tackle it. Now, if I was to give an example of that, I used to work for a company that had a turnover of £350 million. It took produce from 54 countries around the world. In fact, one commodity, bananas, had 9,000 growers in one country in the Central Americas alone. How do we police that? How do we regulate that level? Because if the governments don't have the resources to stop it, and that with modern day thinking is to place it on organisations, how do I police 54 countries, 9,000 commodity growers just in one country alone, and satisfy myself that there isn't exploitation? That's the first part. But then when I compare that to the resources that are offered, at the same time, there was a court case going through the UK courts called Operation Fort, which related to the West Midlands Police um, and the perpetration of a gang operating in the Redditch area of just outside southwest of Birmingham. Now, this gang had been operating for a number of years and had exploited in excess of 300 victims of slavery to potentially 28 clients in the West Midlands. The West Midlands Police Force, who eventually brought the case to fruition, um, got in excess of £750 million, and their organisation is set up to tackle crime. So for twice the turnover and designed to handle it, and it's still going on in Birmingham, how can an organisation tackle it around the world? So that's a massive challenge that you're naturally facing. So then when you get some of these sometimes even minor changes, but what you mentioned about things like Brexit or the problems in Ukraine or Gaza or some of the other issues, the impact might be minor. In those cases, it's not, it's massive. What you end up with is a significant change in vulnerability. And those significant changes in vulnerability place a number of victims under significant stress. Exploitation doesn't just happen in the UK. You can have exploitation happening between Kenya and Ethiopia. Um, it's it it's wherever that vulnerability is there. I think there's a phrase that suggests that the oldest crime in the world is prostitution. I'm a believer that the oldest crime in the world is modern slavery, not just because prostitution is now defined within modern slavery or exploitation. It's just that in the vast majority of cases, somebody has to be controlled before they can be put to work. So therefore, by its very nature, it comes first.
What are the challenges today? If we come right up to date at the moment, we've talked about things that have happened in the past, cases that are coming through. We've talked about the the impact of some of the recent events. If we come right up to today, what are the real challenges that you're seeing today that you're trying to influence, trying to address at the moment? And some of I know we've talked before about some of the measures that have been put in place from a governmental perspective. What impact are they having today?
Well, if I look at the cases that I'm currently working on, I've got issues that are sitting in all fields of the current UK's visa systems. So if we take, there are four main routes. The first one is tier two skilled workers. Tier two skilled workers that are being brought over are being brought over from all areas around the world into businesses that do not have the systems and procedures in place to manage and mitigate the risks associated with that. It's certainly not being controlled. I think there's in excess of 115,000 sponsors businesses now. And while they should be bringing over skilled workers, I think very often these skilled workers are then either leaking out or working in roles that aren't necessarily designed, but it's so unwielding, it's not really being regulated. So there's issues that are sitting there.
Can you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by the tier two
Yeah.
program?
So, so yeah, the tier two is part of the 2016 Immigration Act, which came into effect on the 31st of December 2020. Allowed for a points-based system for people to come over, and businesses to set themselves up as sponsors to be able to bring over some of these skilled workers. You could also bring over some of these skilled workers through that same scheme and even if they weren't skilled, but they were, because you were bringing them over for the purposes of completing the shortage occupation list. So an example of the shortage occupation list using tier two workers would be the care sector. The care sector, there wasn't enough nurses for the care sector. So therefore, under the shortage occupation list, you could bring these people over, and they are now being placed in care homes all around the United Kingdom. Well, how's a care home going to know what the processes are, and what potential vulnerabilities are taking place in their home city of Kathmandu? So therefore, many things are taking place back in the host country. These people are being brought in with good intentions, and there's no suggestion that the care home is perpetrating this in any way. But these people are already being exploited. They're already in debt bondage. They're already being controlled. So I get that type of work. So that's a massive challenge because we can't police the world, yet we have circumstances there. Same thing sits with Tier 5. Now, the Tier 5, which is the seasonal worker scheme, which is far more controlled, which has 6 sponsor companies that bring these workers over, and they are specifically placed in farms around the United Kingdom based against their certificate of sponsorship. They also are facing the same sort of issues, again, fee payments. Because how far can you go back? Can you ask a farm in Gloucestershire to understand truly the whole supply chain of somebody that may be recruited in Nairobi? And at the same time, they are being told, don't tell anybody that you've paid any fees or you won't be granted your visa. So you have the victim in the early stages complicit in the activity because of their vulnerability. Then at a later stage, you then find out that they've been exploited. The worst cases I've had is I found a worker in a field paid £9,100 for 6 months' work. A Nigerian man who'd paid $32,000 to come over and work in the care sector. Some of these numbers are massive, and yet the ability to go and tackle it in the supply chains is almost non-existent. So that's a massive challenge. The third sector is EU settled status. Following Brexit, what the UK government did, because we then very quickly went into COVID also and the outcomes of COVID, was that a scheme was set up for EU settled status, then if you'd been here less than 5 year pre-settled status, but you had an application process where while you was applying, if you were coming in from a European country, you were granted 6 months while your application was being heard. And there was a loophole because if you failed, they just reapplied. And because the Immigration Act places the right to work responsibilities on the employer didn't have visibility of that. So if somebody failed and they just said, it's still being processed, here you go, here's my evidence, they didn't know. And these people were just going on 6 month renewals, and kept on doing it. The government's closed that gap. So there is now a massive declining number in EU settled status workers who didn't have the right to be here, but were on that 6 month application. As they are now being declined and don't have the opportunity to renew, they're seeping into the labour market illegally. Also within that settlement scheme are the British people and those that have indefinite leave to remain. They're also considered settled. Now, obviously, the British people, they've got right to work here. But because of the vulnerabilities that are coming out of the cost of living crisis, people are willing to go work illegally for cash in hand just to try and make ends meet. Again, increasing vulnerabilities. And your indefinite leave to remain people don't have the right to work very often. So they're breaking into the economy because they're desperate to work, because they want a bit more money. And very, very often, many of them, and I know this might not be politically correct, but very often, many of those that are claiming asylum have come over for the purposes of wanting to be economic migrants and actually come for a better life. Now, whether they're successful at that is not the field I get involved in. It's not something I worry about. I just deal with the vulnerabilities that they face. The final group are those that are coming over for student visas. Again, coming out of the Immigration Act, people could come over to come and study in the United Kingdom on a master's visa. They could work 20 hours a week. They could bring over a family dependent who could work for full time. So therefore, somebody could come over for a 1 year course and get 3 years work and possibly work for their partners as well. So it was lucrative. And in fact, I think last year it was the single biggest drawer of people into the United Kingdom. Now, when their courses come to an end, they're not all finding work. So they're left with the scenario of, well, they should be returning back home. But I'm picking up that many of them are now trying to work illegally. And in fact, we ran a recruitment day in near London, June time, early June this year. 46 people came to the recruitment day, only 8 had the documents to work. So the situation is quite stark out there.
Absolutely. In terms of sort of looking forward on this, where do you see this whole area moving? I mean, you said there that the UK government has closed one of the loopholes around the that sort of right to remain scheme. Do you see sort of positive signs that the right changes are being made moving forward? How do you see this whole area developing over the next few years and beyond?
Well, the first thing is I think that the government are, because it's such a hot topic politically, immigration, etc., they're going to come down on it with a heavy hand. And while there needs to be controls, I think my fear is I think it's going to have a disproportionate effect on the corporate world. And the reason why I believe this is they've already increased the fine for employing illegal workers from £5,000 as it was several years ago. They upped that to £20,000. It's now £45,000, but for a repeat offence, £60,000. So that's going to be putting more and more pressure on businesses to police. But as I've already mentioned, it's almost an impossible task, especially for those smaller organisations, to really do this. So I think that's going to be one area that's going to be done. There's going to be a lot more pressure. I think within the corporate world, they're starting to come up with their own schemes for how they're going to police it. And there are things such as employer pays principle, which is getting a bit of traction at the moment, which is saying that businesses should be responsible for any recruitment fees in their whole supply chain. This is getting a lot of pushback for those exact reasons that I've mentioned, where businesses are telling me quite categorically, how can I control what's going on in a foreign land when we don't have the transparency of that? And why should I be financially picking up those costs when my competitors technically aren't, that are operating in other places around the world? So there's a whole part that sits with that. There is a fundamental issue that I have with it, in that it's thought to be, and this is modern thinking, that fee payment is and is often quoted, is a major cause of modern slavery. I actually disagree with that, and I disagree with that on a fundamental level. Fee payments do not cause modern slavery. Exploiters cause modern slavery. They just happen to use fee payments as a method to get to their purpose, to extract money. And therefore,
A little bit more by. Can you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by fee payments in this context?
yeah. So if you've got somebody in Kathmandu, as an example, that has paid an exploiter a fee to get a job in the United Kingdom, and then under the employer pays principle, we then find out about that, and through contractual terms, I'm expected to then pay that worker back. Well, that's not dealing with the issue. That's just adding cost into my business. And it's not treating the problem, which is the exploiter. We need to be finding out what we can and dealing with the exploiter. It's a bit like the bottle and the cap, that we now have all caps attached to bottles, which is absolutely fantastic for recycling, but it's not dealt with the problem, which is the plastic bottle in the first place. Yeah, we're not treating the condition. We're treating the symptoms of it, and I think in the future I can only see that getting worse, and that makes me very nervous, because one thing that we are definitely heading towards is technology. We're already starting to see significant numbers of technological improvements that are changing the world in which we work. Whether it be hearing aids that I wear that can translate. Well, is that going to start replacing the need for those that have gone and done linguistics at university? All of that type of thing. It's going to be changing the world that we live in. Automation at the end of a packing line can now replace people. One of the fears that I have is that the world in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, will probably be completely different by the amount of jobs that aren't there. Therefore, the vulnerabilities to be able to get work and bring that into your families is going to be exacerbated to a massive degree. Yeah, that makes me very nervous. And I'm already starting to see signs of that anyway.
So, just picking on that technology topic there, because that sort of raises a question in my head that I just wanted to talk to you about. We talk a lot about modern slavery being the sort of transportation of people. Again, we've talked about a lot of sort of manual, lower skilled, lower paid roles. What about sort of technology based roles? So, if companies are engaging with a technology provider or a service provider who um, who either directly or usually indirectly through the supply chain is using forced labor in another country for I don't know, mass testing or mass processing or sales calls, or something like that, where you've got people, and there's all sorts of, you see the stories in the newspapers about sort of coerce people stuck in centres in China trying to perpetuate sales calls and things like that. Is that all within the sort of the domain of modern slavery, or
Yeah.
is that a growing problem as well?
Yeah, most definitely. And in fact, actually, let's just think about those two different roles for a moment here. Well, the first one is if you start moving more highly skilled roles into economies where those skills aren't there, or the skills are there, but there's still far many more people that need them. What you do is you do two, which are from the outside, two very good things. One, you educate the population of that potentially third world country, which is fantastic. Um, so brilliant, and you employ them. The chances are you give them more money. I had one case, for example, where one factory in Thailand paid 3 times as much money as the local national minimum wage or local minimum wage that they did, which was superb. Absolutely on the face of it to be brilliant. And because of that, there was an assumption that there wouldn't be exploitation. And I said, you've actually tripled your risk using very basic layman's, because now everybody wants to come and work in your factory and they'll pay to do so because it's lucrative for them to do so now. And now that is not suggesting for 1 second that we shouldn't be pushing wages up, but that volatility and that difference between circumstances generates that. If we also look at wanting skilled workers in the United Kingdom, go back to the nurses. Many nurses that are brought over into the United Kingdom into the care sector are Nepalese, fully trained Kathmandu Nepalese trained nurses. They're very good, highly competent, but there are millions of people in Nepal who want to come over and work in different countries. In fact, when I was last over there, the statistics at the time, and I think this was 2022, the statistics was there was 17 million people of working age in Nepal. 8 million of those every year left the country for foreign lands to go work somewhere else to send money back. And in fact, money repatriation back into Nepal is the second biggest economy of their economy, only dwarfed by agriculture. So if you are leaving a country for a skilled job, you're still paying. So we don't want to be fooling ourselves by thinking, oh, well, these are skilled, highly educated, competent workers, and we're paying them well, and thinking that it's gone away. I actually think that's getting worse, because as we're moving into a more skilled labour force that we need, the exploiters who are running their business are just adapting accordingly to make sure they're moving to their new market.
So what can we what can we do to improve this situation? I mean, you've talked already about the complexities that come with, we've got some big criminal organisations here who look at this very much as a business. It's, these people being trafficked. The victims are effectively just sort of resources or assets that they are they're looking at from a business perspective. You've also got the complexity of extended supply chains. You may not be dealing with companies who are dealing in modern slavery as your third party or even your fourth party. It could well be down fifth, sixth, seventh, um, and and also you've got the conflicting challenges that a lot of corporates have these days around modern slavery is a huge challenge, but so is anti-bribery, so is data privacy, so is cybersecurity. So it's very much a battle for priority on these sort of things. So what can corporates do to be more effective in, I guess, identifying modern slavery and therefore sort of blowing the whistle on it and ultimately helping the victims at the end, rather than a box ticking exercise which says, no, we don't have any modern slavery, there we go, aren't we all happy, it's all green.
Yeah. Um, and I think actually you've just hit the nail on the head with those last comments. That box ticking exercise, once it's blue washing the problem, because I've not seen yet one single modern slavery statement that has prevented a victim. But it's a nice looking statement. If you can go out there and do all of the due diligence checks that you wanted, well, in 2019, we had a victim of exploitation that we safeguarded, and in his back pocket was all of the answers to all of the check questions that organisation did to verify that they hadn't been exploited. And they had all of the answers and all of the questions in their back pocket. So already the exploiters know what you are up to. So the first thing, if we want to do something and we want things to change, then we have to change. So I would encourage corporate organisations to start thinking of situations practically and to adopt 4P approach into to their due diligence processes. And those 4Ps first start with pursue. Assume that it's there. Don't assume that it's not and you've ticked the box. First off, assume it's there because it is. And pursue it. Go look for it. And I'm going to give you a tip in a minute on what to look for as well. Once you've started finding it, then the next P that you need to deal with is to prevent. You need to find out what's happened. You can't do anything about what's happened to the one that's you've found, but you can put in processes and systems to prevent the next one. You can also prepare. You can help your business, your supply chain, your competitors learn from what you spotted so that they can prepare their organisations to help prevent. You can do additional training. You can do additional sign spotting. I'm going to come back to signs. And the final thing is, if you do all of that, all of those first 3 Ps, then you protect. But the part about protect that we don't do very well is understand who we are protecting. At the moment, everything is about protecting the victim. And while I don't disagree that the victim should, of course, be protected, that is not the only thing that needs to be protected. There is no point in being the most ethical business on the planet if you're out of business. You need to make sure you're protecting your brand. You need to make sure you're protecting your system. You need to make sure you're protecting your staff. All of these things are important, and therefore all of your pursuit, all of your prevention, all of your preparation work also needs to include all stakeholders, not just looking at it from a victim perspective, even though that is very, very important. Now, just going back to those signs. A lot of people, when they are looking for signs of modern slavery, they will be told to go look for a sign, look for houses of multiple occupancy, look for shared bank accounts, look for signs of abuse, look for people that are lonely, or all of the relevant physical and psychological signs to look for. And I'm not saying that they're not important, because if you see them, react to them, please. I think where I am slightly different with this is I've learnt over the years that I go look for non-signs. If we think of a sign of modern slavery, in effect is what we would refer to as the presence of abnormal. It's present and it's abnormal. We can see it. Therefore, if that's the case, so can the exploiters. They know we're looking and therefore they can hide it. We need to look for the absence of normal, something that you would expect to be there that isn't. So an example would be, I'm willing to bet that any person that would be listening to this would have had a conversation this week with somebody about what they did last weekend or what they're doing this coming weekend in terms of external activities. Somebody who's being exploited doesn't have that conversation. There's an absence of normal. If you're finding that, then perfect. you're on the path. The next part of pursue, and I do believe that pursuit is arguably the most important aspect, is then to not escalate. And if in doubt, de-escalate. And at the point when you think you should escalate, de-escalate. And just keep on de-escalating, because the chances are the one victim that think you have identified is unlikely to be the only victim. Furthermore, if you have a certain circumstance where a victim is identified and your actions tip off the gang, that victim and other victims will now disappear. I learnt that in 2005 because I broke open a gang in Peterborough, got 7 victims out of exploitation, and as a direct consequence of my actions that day, 53 people disappeared. We have to de-escalate. We need to collect all of the information, and then we need to act like we're not the police. It's not our job to escalate it anyway. It's our job to hand it over to the authorities with the very best amount of information that we have so that they can go do something about it. The amount of times I go to a business and they're telling me that, oh, well, I saw this sign, so I then went and sat down with the worker and they told me everything was fine. Well, first off, they're going to tell you everything is fine. And secondly, well done in telling the gang that you're onto them. So we have to change what we're doing, because all we're doing is poking a bear, and and it's not working.
On that one then, Shayne, so how do you sort of tread that line between, because I think a lot of folks, obviously, when they start to go and look into this, they may see signs of slavery. They may maybe see the obvious signs of slavery that you talked about earlier, and maybe if they're more progressive, they are seeing the absence of normal. How do you know when to report? Because I think a lot of people may be concerned about false reporting.
Yeah.
If you're not going to corroborate that there's a problem there, but you're just going to report to the authorities, is there a risk that people will just end up either not reporting everything because they're concerned that there's actually nothing to see there, or over-reporting and creating noise?
Yeah, and this is a very, very difficult topic, which is why I've got a lot of scenarios I trade out on this now. But let me give you an actual example. While as an operations director for an organisation, I received a report that a worker had been seen stealing food out of the fridge that was the property of another worker, and that was reported to us. Now, that's a potential sign. It also could easily just be somebody that was thieving. But if you look at it from a welfare perspective, no matter what is happening, you have somebody that is clearly hungry, that they needed to go steal somebody else's food. So rather than talk to the worker, which is what 95% of people would go and do, and possibly even in some of those cases dismiss that worker, we did nothing. In fact, what I did was I went and watched CCTV for what had happened in the past, and we actually saw that this person not only had stolen before, for the 2 days previous, but that it also shared the contents of that food with 2 workers sitting at the same table. So we now had an escalation, if you like, in terms of the circumstance, because not only did we have 1 victim, we had 3, and we had something that might be sitting as a welfare issue that sat behind it. So what I decided at that point with myself and my team was that we were going to put some petty cash together, because we were about to go into the weekend, and spoke to the supervisor and said, if anybody reports to you that they've had their food stolen, just note the time and when it happened, and give them some money so that they can get some food for themselves. And we went and built this over the weekend. And I also got that same supervisor to observe from a distance, to not make themselves known, to go and see who's coming in, are these people travelling together, all of the other bits that sat around them, get their personal files together, and then we go do some checks. By the Tuesday of the next week, we had enough information to then escalate to the authorities that these were potential victims of exploitation. When the authorities came in, which they did, they responded the next day on the Wednesday. They sat down with them and they went on to tell them that these people had actually been exploited in a hotel within London. Um, Now, what we then did was, knowing that they had been exploited, or the authorities had identified that had been exploited in London, what they had then done is escaped, jumped on a train without paying, got themselves up to the local area, walked across to an old friend's house, who then directed them towards a labour provider who eventually then placed them in our facility. They were only in our facility by chance, but because they had to work 10 days before they could get paid, they just simply had not received any money yet. So therefore they were hungry. So the next thing we then did was we cooked them a meal. There are different things you can do that don't mean you have to escalate it. We de-escalated, found out what we were dealing with, and then dealt with the problem. If that had been a real slavery case, a real exploitation case, who's to say that one of the two people that had the food shared with them was not one of the perpetrators? To say, go steal that and come and feed me. You don't know what you're dealing with, so you need to de-escalate and find out the information before you escalate it.
So if we look at most sort of large-scale corporate organisations, they will have due diligence programs in place. You talked about the policy and the effectiveness of that. But if you actually look at the processes, they will have due diligence processes looking at the third parties. They will potentially be identifying fourth parties, depending on the industry, maybe fifth and sixth. What checks can they do? I mean, how can you put effective due diligence in place that is at a B2B level? I mean, if you're doing individual worker vetting, there's obviously a lot you can do, and we've touched on a number of those things. But is there anything you can effectively do at a B2B level that can move the dial on this topic?
Well, yeah. So say, for example, you are a corporate organisation and you use a cleaning company that come in 8 p.m. every evening to clean your offices. Now, I'm sure you've got all the policies, procedures, checks, you do all the audits of them, etc., etc. But what physical barriers do you have in place, and how robust are those systems to stop substitution? Going back to the fact that that's the most likely you're going to have exploiters that are going to come in. It's going to be somebody that is a so-called person that you've checked that another person is going to come in and do the work for them. I had a case May this year where we found an address where the company had no idea it was a house of multiple occupancy, because the gang had shared all these people around. It turned out there was 15 people from one address. But how we had identified it was because we had spotted that there was a substituted worker. We de-escalated and found out as much information as we could, and then realised that it was potentially affecting other businesses. So we got in contact with those other businesses and we talked them through the process, that they're not to escalate, but we need them to check this address and do they have anybody. And it just built and it built and it built. And then after about a month, we passed all of the information over to the authorities and said, we've got what we would consider a transit house. They come into this house and they get moved on from there. But these were Bulgarian and Romanian nationals, and it was highly orchestrated, but would only have been able to have identified it by working together with other businesses. Going to go do a check on the audit itself, the labour provider would never have spotted it. I just want to give another example as well in terms of checks and making sure that you're looking at processes. I had a circumstance where a exploiter was working with a recruiter in the home country and was telling this recruiter recruit them, charge them, tell them to see me when they arrive. This person then arranged for them to be picked up from the airport. On collection from the airport, where they were charged £110, they were then told they were going to be taken to an address where they could complete their application form for the EU settled status, one of the examples that I said is now being closed as a loophole. Now, when they completed that status check, they charged them £250. It is only an application. You cannot fail it. You're just being put into the system. If 2 or 3 weeks later, they were going up to, or one of the henchmen was going up to the workers and saying, you failed your application, but it's okay. The perpetrator is willing to turn a blind eye to it as long as you pay them 20% of your wages per week. Now, let's just think about that for a moment. None of that activity is within the process of audit. And even if it was, the legality of the workers was not questionable because they had the right to be here. If I had suspected that they were illegal, which I had no reason to suspect that, and I had have asked them, they wouldn't have told me because they thought they were illegal, because they, even though they had the right to be here, they were being convinced that they were doing something illegal. So they wouldn't tell me. So the only way to get into that is to get into the process and to start thinking like an exploiter. You're not going to get and find those issues by sitting in the outside and ticking a box. You just don't. It just doesn't happen.
So I think one of the things that's very clear here, I mean, obviously what we've got here is a huge and very complex situation that, will affect different businesses and different organizations in different ways, depending on the interactions that they've got. I think there's a huge opportunity for more effective processes. I think,
Yeah.
you touched on substitution there as being a key area. And it would strike me that one way of doing that would be, spot checks that the people actually coming in are the people who are meant to be coming in. For example, even if it's just, are they the same name? I mean, it sounds like there's, it's going to be extremely difficult to eradicate this completely, and it will require a very consolidated and sort of joined up approach from government and corporates, etc. But at an individual corporate level, there's definitely more that can be done in terms of increasing your vigilance, increasing those checks over it, and in many ways making your organization less of a target for those exploiters. Because if you are going and checking that the person coming in is the person who they meant to be coming in, you will look like you have stronger controls than somebody else, for example. Now that
Yeah.
we can shift the problem from one place to another, but if everybody starts to do that, it will make this a lot more difficult, one assumes.
It will, and it's not like we don't have the skills to go and do it, because if we take risk and risk management, and let's just apply it from a health and safety perspective at the moment. We all have health and safety responsibilities, and therefore we have to manage and mitigate risks as a consequence of somebody being harmed through that. Well, first off, exploitation of people. Well, health and safety should actually be picking that up anyway, because it's health, safety and welfare of workers. And of course, it's their welfare is definitely covered by exploitation. But there's a little tool within the HSE called the hierarchy of risk management. And it starts with looking at a process where somebody can be harmed and how. What do you do to mitigate it? Well, the first thing you look at is to eliminate it. If you can't eliminate it, can you substitute it for a lower risk? If you can't substitute it, can you segregate people from that harm? If you can't segregate from the harm, then you need to administrate, and that thing is like signs, training, etc. And then finally, you would provide them with personal protective equipment. To give that a little bit more context from a HSE perspective, if I didn't want somebody to be hurt by a fork truck, I would see what I could do about eliminating fork trucks. If I can't eliminate it, can I substitute it for, say, a pallet truck or something smaller in size? If I can't do that, can I put walkways up and barriers and segregate? If I can't do that, can I put rules in place to sound horn when going through doors, or make sure there's signs up and all the relevant training for people? And once I've done that, the final thing I would do is put somebody in a high-vis. And the simple reason is because the high-vis vest has never, in the history of high-vis vests, stopped a fork truck from hitting them. That's what we're doing very often in the tick boxing. We're jumping straight to the high-vis vest bit, and we're not doing all of that process management at the top to actually mitigate the risk. So if you take a corporate business and they're identifying the risk, the first thing is, well, can I eliminate it? Can I just not do that anymore? If I can't eliminate it, can I substitute? Can I bring these people in a different way that mitigates the risk and makes it lower? If I can't do that, can I segregate my business from that risk? Can I place that risk onto somebody else? And that's not abdicating your responsibility, but you could be passing it on to somebody who's better skilled to manage the risk. If you can't do that, what are your rules, processes and procedures? This is where very often most businesses go in at this level. And then finally, we do the protection stuff at the end. I just think that we just need to think of it slightly differently.
Shayne, extremely interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time to run through this with us and just highlight what a big, complex area this is with very real human cost involved in it. And I think, quite often the third-party risk space is, we're stretched across areas, and there's a lot of focus on things like resilience, a lot of focus on cyber, all extremely important topics. But this is a topic where we can make a real difference and really help affect people's lives. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I'm sure I will be asking you back at some point soon to expand on some of these amazing topics. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much, Mike, for the opportunity. Nice to speak with you again.
Thank you for listening to Third Party Therapy. If you like that, why not click on the like button below and subscribe so you get updates in the future, and head over to thirdpartytherapy.com and sign up to our mailing list. Thank you very much.